Welcome to this conversation. So today I am joined by Jamie Woodhouse, who I have followed for a few years. I don't know how many years, but a few years now. I've listened to your podcast. So Jamie is an activist. He is really engaged in trying to promote this idea or worldview of sentientism, and that's what we're going to get into today. Jamie, I'll hand over to you first to give a bit of an intro into how did you first get involved in this sort of thing, care about sentientism, sentient animals in general, and then I'll go into a bit of the framing of why I wanted to have this conversation with you. But over to you first.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. So I guess a good place to start is that even since I was a kid, I had this sort of fascination, amateurish fascination with philosophy in general, but particularly worldviews, because they seem to be the sort of deepest part of human thinking. You know, if you keep asking the question, why do you believe something or why do you care about something? At the bottom, I think that's where our worldviews sit, right? So I've always found them fascinating because they're sort of so deep, but also because they're worldviews, they affect absolutely everything. So their impacts ripple out through everything humans do and all our beliefs and all our actions. So I've long had that sort of fascination with the idea of worldviews. And I guess I've had my own journey through different types of worldviews myself, which I'm happy to walk through if that's interesting. But in simple terms, I got frustrated that if you think about the menu of worldviews that are out there, and there might be thousands of different religious worldviews, and there are non-religious worldviews as well, like humanism, there didn't seem to be any that really fit the way I thought about the world and the way a lot of other people thought about the world. And sentientism is a response to that. So, let's take this term out of 1970s academia and recast it as a modern worldview that's based on some really ancient ideas that seems to fit, the way I and lots of other people think about the world, and see if we can normalize it and spread it around.
So I'll go into a bit about why I wanted to have this conversation with you. And then maybe we can flesh out what sentientism is a bit more. But I think it's probably going to be obvious to people watching so far. They've probably got just from the term alone that it is something to do with sentience.
Yeah.
And obviously,
is it worth me giving the sort of basics of what it is and what it's about? Do you want me to start there? Before?
Yeah. Okay. Go with that, and then I'll tell you. Yeah.
I think sentientism, like most of the other worldviews, right, really broad ways of thinking about everything, are trying to answer two different really deep questions. One is just how do we go about understanding this amazing universe we all share, right? So it's the questions of epistemology. What do we base our beliefs and our knowledge and our credences on? So that's one big question. And the other one, just as important, is the foundational questions of ethics. What matters and who matters? And as you survey all the different worldviews out there, you'll find different answers to those questions. But sentientism answers them with, in one line, evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So when we're thinking about what to believe or how to base our credences, sentientism doesn't have any specific beliefs that you must hold on to. So whereas in Christianity, there are certain things you believe, or in Jainism, there are certain things you believe. In sentientism, there are no specific beliefs, but there is a commitment to using evidence and reason, so intellectual humility, open-mindedness, yes, using science, but also our senses and other forms of good evidence to sort of frame and form our credences, to update them, never being stuck in dogma, being open-minded, changing our mind when the evidence changes, all of that sort of stuff. So that's just a epistemological commitment to understanding the world. And it can lead you to lots of different beliefs, but at least you agree on the method. So in that sense, it has quite a lot in common with secular modern humanism, for example, which says, look, let's use evidence and reason and a broadly scientific way of understanding the world. On the ethical side, it's also maybe irritatingly pluralistic because it's quite open-minded about what your ethical system is. Do you use utility or rights or feminist care ethics or deontology, or, the list goes on, right? It almost says, look, do what you like, but every sentient being should matter and should matter seriously in our moral consideration. And a sentient being, it comes from the Latin sentire, it means to feel. Basically, if you can feel anything at all, if you experience anything at all, whether it's a simple pain or pleasure or something more complex like love or existential angst, if you feel or experience anything at all, you're a sentient being and you should matter morally. And that's basically it. So it's very pluralistic, it's very broad, but at the same time, it has some very radical implications for almost every aspect of human thought and life. So that's a quick summary of what sentientism is: evidence and reason and compassion for all sentient beings, and a serious compassion as well. It can't just be tokenistic.
So the reason I wanted to have this conversation with you is because I obviously, the main topic I sort of explore on my channel is antinatalism and the ethics of bringing sentient life into existence, or that's how I frame it anyway.
Yeah.
And I don't know how familiar you are with the antinatalist world, but one of the sort of core fault lines or fractures in it is a care for sentience and basing our moral consideration on sentience, and one that's more anthropocentric. And I think I wanted to have this conversation because I wanted to try and bridge the gap between those two camps and try and, obviously I'm going to want to try and bring some of the anthropocentric people over to my way of thinking. So that's why I'm kind of having a conversation with you, because we align on that topic. But that's why I wanted to have this conversation, because I wanted to try and bring a stronger sentientist norm into the antinatalist space. So I wanted to explore that idea with you. So to that end, if you were having a conversation with someone who was unlike me, because obviously we already align on something like sentientism, but if I was someone who maybe I haven't explored ethics that much, or maybe I have explored ethics a bit, but I haven't really explored why I should care about sentience specifically, and why not sort of keep my moral consideration for mainly humans, can you give a sort of intro as to why should we care about sentience at all, rather than just a care for humans? Why should we care about all sentient beings?
Yeah. One way into it is, I think a lot of people who care about other humans, and hopefully most of us care about some humans, and hopefully many people care, at least in theory, about all humans, is because they care about other humans because they're sentient. So in a way, I think many people, even if they have an anthropocentric frame, still agree with this sort of basic idea that the reason you matter to me is not because we happen to share the same species designation. It's actually because you can feel things, you can experience things. So that's why I care about, you being hurt or you being killed, because I have this empathic connection with what it might be like to be you. I know I don't like feeling pain. I know you don't like feeling pain. And it's that's ultimately the reason why we care about other humans. So I think when you explore this with people, quite often they will come up with other reasons why we might care about humans. But when you dig down and say, well, yeah, but why is that and why is that? Quite often people will come back to sentience and this capacity to feel and experience anyway. So I think it's actually more commonly held than people think. The difficulty is that we then don't follow the logic to the next step to say, well, if I care about the suffering of other humans, or I care about the fact that other humans want to live, or that other humans want to be free, want to express their autonomy, and the reason I care about them is because of their freedom or their ability to feel, or because their wish to continue living. And if I want to be consistent, then shouldn't I also extend my compassion and moral consideration to all of the non-humans that also have feelings, have interests, have perspectives? And that's where the blocker comes in. So I think many people who believe in universal human rights, if you look at the nature of human rights, right, many of them are linked not just to the fact that we're part of a species, they're linked to our capacity to suffer. That's why we have a human right against being tortured, is because being tortured is painful, and painful is, to be able to feel pain is because you're sentient. It's not because you're human. So that's quite a constructive way, I think, into the conversation. But then human psychology and sociology and all of these other reasons block us from following the logic. There is another type of response that can lead people to say, well, no, only humans should matter. But quite often they depend on a sort of supernatural basis. So if you believe, for example, that humans were made in the image of a god, or that humans were given dominion over other beings on the planet, or that only humans have souls and non-human animals don't have souls, those are all reasons to stick to humans, right? I think they're flawed reasons because I think they're based on a worldview that isn't true and is fabricated, right? But if you hold those sorts of worldviews, at least you've got a line of argument. If you have a naturalistic worldview, which is grounded in using evidence and reason, humble, open-minded, engaging with reality as you find it, you can't rely on those arguments anymore. You have to come up with something else. And I don't really think there is something else. So the other thing that will happen when you tease this out, normally people will agree that human suffering matters, and you'll say, well, then surely all suffering should matter. They'll resist by saying, okay, but human suffering and human interests matter, but they matter because we as humans have these extra capacities and extra capabilities that maybe set us aside from non-human animals. And you can run through quite an interesting list, right? Is it intelligence? Is it the capacity for language? Is it creativity? Is it the fact we can reciprocate and make contracts? Is it the fact we can make moral decisions? There's a long, long list, and you can go on for as long as you like coming up with those ideas. But you tend to hit a few problems. One is that quite often we're underestimating animals' ability to do those types of things. So if you listen to Frans de Waal, who I had the pleasure of interviewing before his sad death, actually non-human animals have enormous capacities for moral action and for intelligence and for creativity, right? So on the one hand, as you follow a scientific approach to understanding non-human animals, you'll realize that their capabilities are actually more impressive than some of our human capabilities. So that's just one point of caution. But you'll also realize that if you're going to focus on those capacities as the reason someone matters, you're now cutting out a lot of humans, right? So you're cutting out maybe adult humans that don't have those capacities for whatever reason. And you're also cutting out human babies and infants who generally don't have any of those capacities whatsoever. So you're faced with this difficult dilemma, which is if you say, well, if it's about intelligence or it's about capacity for language, well, ultimately you've got two choices, right? Either you double down on that criteria and you say, okay, maybe this means I need to include some non-human animals, right? Because an adult pig is more intelligent than a 3-year-old human baby, right? Or human toddler. So I have to include some non-human animals in my moral consideration. And at the same time, I have to exclude that to a 3-year-old toddler because they don't meet my intelligence bar. So if you go down that route and you are really serious about using that capacity as a criteria for moral consideration, you've broken universal human rights. You cannot have those anymore. You can't have anthropocentrism anymore because you've excluded loads of humans. And you can't have anthropocentrism anymore because you've now included loads of non-humans, right? So you're in a weird position by picking that capacity. The better alternative is to recognize that those capacities are not morally salient at all. It shouldn't matter, even if we're just thinking about intrahuman ethics. If someone said, well, more intelligent people should be more morally significant and matter more, most of us would be outraged. But then people use that as a criteria to defend the human, non-human animal boundary. And you can go through most of the others as well. If you're going to use capacities to differentiate between humans morally, that's called ableism, right? And most progressive people would reject that as a foundationless form of discrimination where you're judging people morally based on their capacities. It doesn't feel like it's right. So if you want to reject ableism, you can't use that list of capacities to defend only caring about humans. The distinction doesn't break down. It just doesn't work. And again, constructively, I don't think there are many people who are really determined that only humans should matter, right? Almost every human has already stepped across that species boundary to some degree already, right? So they might have a companion animal in their house. They might be outraged when a footballer kicks a puppy on a YouTube video. They will be deeply concerned for dolphins and gorillas and charismatic wildlife. So most humans have already stepped across that boundary. And once you've stepped across that boundary, again, this is a big if, right? But if you want your morality to be coherent and consistent and rationally grounded, right, rather than just something arbitrary that you've made up, well, then you have to do that consistently. So I think there are some challenging ways of addressing it, but there are also some constructive ways of addressing it because, in a sense, most humans intuitively already share a degree of this sort of sentiocentric compassion, this idea that all suffering matters, all interests matter. And it's really human psychology and social norms that are sort of blocking us from putting that latent compassion that goes way beyond the human into practice.
So there were a couple of instances in your answer where you mentioned maybe certain biases, or there are certain elements of our psychology or features of our psychology that are maybe preventing us or making it harder for us to reach a sentious conclusion. And do you have any sense of what those features of our psychology are and why we find it hard to reach these conclusions, and when we do reach these conclusions, start to practically implement what they may mean for our behavior?
Yeah, I mean, there's almost too many to list, but I can zero in on some big favorites. And I spend a reasonable amount of time, given sentientism is, about using evidence and reason, it's a naturalistic approach, quite a lot of time talking to humanists and secularists and atheists and rationalists and skeptics and people who are very proud of their, use of evidence and reason, right? So these are the sort of people who will memorize a list of fallacies and call them off and have them as a poster on their wall, right? And cognitive biases that we should be aware of. So, but I find it fascinating talking to those people who are steeped in, supposedly rational thought about this topic, because it's the perfect case study for when all of these cognitive biases and all of these logical fallacies seem to be brought onto this topic all at once, even by those who are very proud of their ability to spot fallacies and cognitive biases. So it's a really interesting case study. If you want to understand human psychology and sociology and social norms and political power dynamics, talking about this topic about caring about non-human animals, particularly when you get into spaces like animal agriculture, is just the absolute perfect case study. So I think I could probably run through one of those posters with all the cognitive biases and the fallacies and pick out examples of absolutely every single one being used to justify our exclusion of non-human animals, or if not to exclude them, to justify our harsh, brutal, exploitative treatment of them. But I think the core thing to focus on is that, again, coming back to this naturalistic understanding of who you and I are and who we are as humans, we are not some sort of mystical truth seeker, and we are not some sort of perfect moral being either, right? We're basically a type of social ape. So a great deal of what our minds are doing is really about how to fit in, how to comply, and how to conform. And also how we can think positively about ourselves and the people around us. So in that context, where the textbook approach to these problems might be to start from, some founding axioms and some basic principles, and then step by step, you logically and philosophically work through, and eventually you get to the implications, which you face bravely, right? That's just not how humans work, or the ones who do work that way are pretty weird, right? Weird and wonderful. What tends to happen is really just backwards thinking. So I think most of us start out thinking, well, I'm a good person. I know I am because I feel I'm a good person. Right? It's quite rare to feel that you're, or to acknowledge that you're not a good person. So I'm a good person. The people around me, they're good people. They're well-meaning people. I engage with them. We, cooperate with each other. We're kind to each other. We're good people too. The social norms of the communities I'm in, are good social norms, right? Again, we care about each other. We're, so the things we do together and individually, must be good, right? And anything that challenges that, we will respond to defensively. And we will respond particularly defensively when the challenge that's coming in and saying, well, actually this social norm is causing harm to those other people or those other beings. We get particularly defensive if we're complicit in that harm, right? It's very hard. I mean, you and I, we know this from our own lives, right? If you've made a mistake, you've hurt someone, you've done something wrong, admitting that is emotionally extremely difficult. So in this wide context, if someone points out to you the egregious harms of animal agriculture, for example, and of course, like most people, it's something you fund needlessly 2 or 3 times a day, that can be hard to face, right? Because when you're faced with that sort of challenge about a remote, powerful system that you know, in a small way support, your instinctive response is to find a way of justifying why what you're doing is okay, because you know you're a good person and the people around you are good people and they all do the same thing, rather than doing the sort of more philosophically pure thing of empathizing and having compassion for the beings that are impacted in those systems and reevaluating whether you really want to be supporting those systems or not. So I think it's that sort of social norm thing, that really strong social norm compliance driver in most human minds that explains an enormous amount of this type of problem. Because I think if most humans alive today had just been brought up in a sentientist world where we had compassion for and respect for all sentient beings, regardless of their species, regardless of their race or caste or sexuality or gender or wealth level or intellect, or whether they were good looking or not, or what their species was, right? If we just had unconditional respect and compassion for all of them, I don't think many people would fight it. I don't think many people would be saying, okay, but there's that group of people over there, now I want to start hurting them. Or there's a species of animal out there that maybe we can domesticate and slaughter and then eat their flesh. I just don't think that's the way we would work, because I think most of us do have a latent compassion that goes beyond the human species that's probably been in us since humans evolved 200,000 years ago. It's mostly reasonably recent modern social norms about the systemic exploitation of others, human and not, have made these things normal. And because we've grown up in an environment where they are normal, we then have a really strong motivation to justify why they must be good. Yeah, so I think it's that social norm thing, and then it's this, this normal is good fallacy too. That's probably two of the big ones.
So I think you've kind of gestured throughout your answers so far, but not made explicit, some of the implications of sentientism. And I wanted to kind of explore some of those now. So I wanted to kind of break it down first into us as individuals and then maybe society at large. So if someone were to adopt a sentientist worldview, they were to say, okay, I used to reserve much of my moral consideration for humans, but now I'm fully embracing this idea that we should understand the world using reason and evidence, and we should have compassion for all sentient beings. What do you think the implications of accepting such a view would be for their behavior, assuming they have the behavior of maybe the average sort of person, which I know is difficult because I know the world is so big, there's maybe not an average person, but in broad strokes, what do you think are the kinds of changes that someone would have to make to their life and their behavior?
I mean, it can be easier to work the other way around in a way, because it's much easier for us to evaluate, global things and systems and other stuff, partly because that's often less threatening than our, individual behaviors. But I think a few things I would call out. One would be this commitment to using evidence and reason seems quite innocuous. Most people would say, of course, right, Jamie, why would I not want to believe things based on evidence and reason? I already do. But it's a bit more challenging than that, because it has to be done well, right? Because the alternatives to using evidence and reason as an epistemology might include, for example, a declaration of faith, which normally doesn't require evidence and is impervious to evidence. So if you have an unconditional faith in something, it doesn't matter what the evidence is, you will still continue to believe. That can be linked to a dogmatic approach, which again, by definition, you're stuck with whatever the evidence says and whatever the reasoning around it is. It's also tends to be skeptical of revelation, in the sense of, for example, a religious revelation or a mental experience, right? I think in a way, everything comes to us through our mental experiences, but we should be skeptical of them too, because they're evolved pieces of kit rather than, again, magical truth seekers. So, whether you have a psychological or psychedelic experience or whether you have a religious revelation, I think neither of those should necessarily lead us too quickly into believing the things we experience in those. And it would also lead us to be quite skeptical of authority, of believing something just because it's in a book or because some powerful figure tells us, right? So on the one hand, it would suggest we should, drop those types of ways of believing, right? And we should concentrate on doing evidence and reasoning, but that has to be done well, because evidence and reasoning can be done very badly too, right? So pseudoscience uses the language and the terminology and the techniques of evidence and reasoning, but it's not done in good faith, right? So you have to be skeptical even of people doing evidence and reasoning. So I think the things it would mean is, one, avoiding dogma. If there's a belief you have that is 100% locked in and you will never change your mind on it, I don't think you're really doing evidence and reasoning. You should always leave some space for doubt, some wiggle room, some ability to have your mind changed, right? So I'm an atheist, for example. I'm pretty confident that there is no God, but I wouldn't say I'm 100% confident, right? If there's decent evidence and the reasoning shifts, I would genuinely change my mind. However unlikely I think that might be now. So that's one thing. I think you have to be ready to change your mind, and you cannot be dogmatic anywhere. The other thing is, it's quite hard to apply this evidence and reasoning approach in every domain of your thought. So most people will use it somewhere where it's convenient, where it's easy, where it's useful, but then they'll reserve a space, right, where they don't want to do the evidence and reason thing, because there might be a cultural commitment or a traditional commitment or a religious commitment they want to hold on to, or there might be an implication they don't want to face, right? So they might have a dogmatic belief that non-human animals aren't sentient because it enables them to feel okay about animal agriculture. Or in my case, I might believe that Norwich City are the finest football team the world has ever seen, right? And it's just a belief I will never give up, despite the evidence of every Saturday when we play. So it's a joke, but basically, I think those are two of the things, right? You cannot be dogmatic. You have to be willing to change your mind, whatever your belief is, and you have to aspire to use it absolutely everywhere. You can't really carve out sort of special areas that are convenient to you. So that evidence and reason challenge is tougher than it might initially seem. So I think that would be one aspiration. I think part of it is also never thinking you're doing that perfectly. As soon as you think, I sometimes, when I'm running workshops in classrooms with kids, right? I was a couple of weeks ago, I was in a classroom with some year 10s, and I'm like, who here thinks they're always right about everything and has never made a mistake? And there's always a couple of little boys who will put their hand up and go, but generally, if you think you're always right, you're definitely wrong somewhere, right? So there's that humility that's part of it too. So that's the evidence and reason part, and you can run that through every aspect of your life, right? That could be personal practical decisions, it can be how you vote, it could be what sort of job you want to do, where you donate to charity. You can apply that to absolutely every type of belief you have. And on the compassion for all sentient beings side, it's tough because, again, there is no way of doing it perfectly. I don't think there's such a thing as perfect ethics. I don't think the universe owes us such a thing. But there are ways you can look through your life and work out where you might be needlessly causing harm, exploitation, or death to sentient beings, right? And one of the most obvious examples of that is in, our engagement with animal exploitation industries like agriculture. So sentientism leads you pretty directly to veganism. So that's probably one of the starkest and most obvious clashes between sentientism and default modern social norms, is that the practice of animal agriculture and lots of other uses of non-human sentient animals is just seen as needless and harmful, and we should try and stop doing it as much as possible. So veganism will be one practical implication that would jump out. And it's probably worth explaining why that is, because a lot of people will think of veganism and will immediately think it's about food choices and diet. And that's one of the implications of veganism. But actually, veganism is just a practical philosophical stance that says, in simple terms, exploiting, harming, and killing non-human animals, which is a shortcut way of saying sentient beings for most vegans, is something bad, and I will do what I reasonably and practicably can to avoid causing it through boycotting it. So if you have compassion for all sentient beings, well, of course you would be against their exploitation, needless suffering, and death. So it's quite a direct connection across. But you'd apply it in all sorts of other areas of your life as well. So, just as within intrahuman ethics, we would work to resist our, impulses to discriminate or harm other humans. We would work against exploitation, needless harm or suffering, or killing of any human being, because they're all sentient too. And we would have compassion for ourselves, because we're sentient beings too. So we might want to start there. So there's no particularly easy answers, but I think one starting point would be to survey your life and the decisions you take and work out where you can strip out the things that are needlessly causing harm or death or exploitation to others. And yeah, veganism is an obvious place to start.
And you kind of mentioned systemic things as well. And
Yeah.
do you think there are any ways that we would have to? Well, I'm assuming there are, because for many people it's a radical worldview shift. But are there any ways that we would need to sort of change our society to adapt to being centered around a sentience worldview that aren't maybe obvious from what you've already said about individual changes? So just to sort of elaborate of where I'm going. So one example could be that obviously the legislation of pretty much every country in the world would need to be radically reformed, because the scope of beings and the sort of weight of consideration given to those beings is obviously going to increase, and that's going to have quite radical implications for our justice system, for example. Is there anything like that on a more systemic scale that you think should be fleshed out?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the things I love about worldviews in general, because if you take them seriously, they affect everything. So, for example, if you ran, every level of human government from the UN all the way down to your local council or your local state on Christian principles, for example, that would have radical implications for how people go about believing stuff and the policies that are enacted and the ethical systems that are within that. So in a similar way, adopting a sentientist worldview at different levels of government or governance would have, also radical implications for almost every domain of human thought. And you can run some really interesting thought experiments, and this is part of the work we do in sentientist communities, including people who, disagree with sentientism, but we still sort of work on these ideas, is to reimagine those different areas of human activity and thought from a sentientist lens. So an obvious starting point might be the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We've rewritten that as a Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. And it's easier than you might think, because actually the most important rights for human sentient beings are actually pretty common across the evolutionary tree with other sentient beings too. You can reimagine things like the Sustainable Development Goals, which really, although they are about the environment and they do mention animals here and there, are written to protect the environment for humans. So it's about international development for humans and sustainability for humans. So you can rewrite the Sustainable Development Goals with the interests of all sentient beings in mind. As you say, you can think about policies at different levels, from the UN through national governments, through local governments, about what sort of things will be allowed, what sort of things would be encouraged, what sort of things will be even illegal. And that's quite a radical shift in all of those mechanisms. It would also change the way politics is done. So you might think about shifting from a democracy to maybe something like a sentiocracy, where non-human sentient beings would actually have some form of representation within our political systems and our decision making. So rather than it just being humans deciding in a way that hopefully cares about other sentient beings, maybe we could even involve them in some way. And I'm not suggesting that you would have chickens in Parliament voting in the same way, because you would have to respect and recognise their capacities, their willingness, their interest in getting involved in politics. But in the same way as human babies, right, are represented in our politics in various ways, but we don't expect them to go and vote, right? I think you could think in analogous ways about non-human animals having representation in our politics too. I think you could reimagine economics. So the root of economics isn't money or transactions. The root of economics is actually value, right? The reason we buy and sell things, or we transact together, or we do things, is ultimately because we as humans value those things. So you can ask the question, well, non-human sentient beings value things too. Is there some way of imagining a sentientist economics that would radically change our economic thinking so that the interests of non-human sentient beings would be represented? You can get into justice and law, of course. There are already some laws that are extending rights and protections way beyond the human. Some even beyond sentient beings. There are protections around non-human animal cruelty, although weakly enforced in many countries. So you can already see where things are developing in these fields, but you could take a really radical next step in allowing the law and justice systems to take non-human sentient beings seriously as well. And there are echoes through history. I mean, in medieval France, there were court cases where pigs were put on trial for murder, for example. So I'm not suggesting we want to go there, but you can see these echoes through human history of, for a long while, humans have taken non-human sentient beings, as serious agents in their own right. But then you can run through some of the softer stuff as well. So you can think about the language we use. This mug is an it, but Luna the puppy downstairs is not an it. She's a she, right? So you can think about how our language might change when we refer to non-human sentient beings. You might think about the fact that we have homicide and genocide, and people are developing the idea of ecocide as the idea of, criminal destruction of the environment. What about the word senticide, which I think I'm the only person who uses at the moment, but it's the idea that killing a non-human sentient being or even a human sentient being is wrong and maybe should even be criminal. So you can run it through our language and our legal systems too. But you can also think through culture and stories and narratives, and how so many of our cultural artifacts, from films to even music to stories, are just infused with a really human-centric point of view. But even so, you still even now get glimmers of light from, Anna Sewell's Black Beauty or films like Gunda, where, okay, there is a different perspective, right? It's not only humans who have perspectives and interests, and maybe there are, other ways of imagining non-human sentient beings. So, yeah, almost every area of human thought and activity you can reimagine based on grounding our understanding in evidence and reason, and by having a serious compassion for all sentient beings. And to my mind, it's a radical vision, but it's also a deeply hopeful vision, because I think if you have any concern for non-humans whatsoever, and you have a wider environmental concern, the track record of humanity so far has been pretty mixed, right? Pretty bleak, and some might even say fairly awful. And reimagining, a sentientist world at least gives a sort of hopeful vision for the type of positive role humanity might be able to play with respect to wider sentientity. Whether we could actually get there or not is a very different question, but at least it's a vision for humanity playing a positive role in the world.
So I know that you've obviously, through your podcast, the Sentientism Podcast, you've spoken to many, many different people about this topic that have agreed, disagreed, come from all sorts of different perspectives. And you are maybe one of the people in the world that's sort of most plugged into this specific area of discussion and discourse. And I wanted to now kind of pick your brains about how we could maybe think about the creation of sentience and the ethics of creating sentience. Now, I think I'm correct in saying that sentientism as a worldview wouldn't dictate any specific view on whether we should create sentience or not. It's more about, once a sentient being is here, they deserve compassion, moral consideration. And so I understand that, it's not sentientism saying any of this stuff, but I wondered, as someone who's very engaged in this discourse, not even necessarily giving your own opinion on this, obviously you're free to do that, but as someone who's very plugged into this space and has spoken to many people about sentience as the basis for moral consideration, what are the different things you think we maybe need to consider when thinking about the ethics of creating sentience, whether or not we fall on the side of it is ethical to create it or it's not ethical to create it? What are the sort of things you think we should be considering when thinking about that issue? Sorry, one final thing on as an addendum onto this question.
Yeah,
obviously this is potentially quite a practical thing even for non-antinatalists when we're starting to think of potentially sentient AI or artificial sentience or something like this, which I know is something that is discussed in sentientist circles. So yeah, bit of a long question there, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that I think one of the strengths of sentientism is it's very pluralistic, and because it's really just trying to set a baseline for our worldview, using evidence and reason to understand the world and having serious compassion for all sentient beings. It doesn't say any more than that. So when we're developing these projects about what it might mean for democracy or law or justice or so on, we're getting into much more specific implications that people might well disagree about. But at the same time, that pluralism can be a bit annoying because exactly as you say, it doesn't tell you the answer to a question like, antinatalism and the ethics of creation. And there's loads of other questions that it doesn't tell you the answer to either. It just says, use evidence and reason, have compassion for all sentient beings. Now, good luck continuing to fight over these important topics. So I guess that's a starting point. You're right. It doesn't land on one side or the other. And within our sentientism communities and in the conversations I've had on the podcast and YouTube, there's an enormous diversity of different views about the ethics of creating sentient beings. I think one thing I would say is that people see it as a serious question and a serious responsibility. This is not something to be done lightly, because if you have a serious compassion for a sentient being, by creating them, you are putting them in a position where good things could happen, but bad things could happen, right? You are creating a being that matters deeply and seriously, and you are exposing that being to risk, right? So I think many sentientists would say, well, until the point a sentient being exists, they're not a moral patient, they don't matter, they can't be considered in that sense because they're not sentient and they don't yet exist, and they may never exist. But conditional on them existing in the future, we should take them into consideration, because if they do come into existence, they will matter, and they will matter seriously. So it means it's a serious moral responsibility, the act of creation. So in the AI space, this is a rapidly developing field, and most of the concern about artificial intelligence, apart from just making as much money as they can, is about the risk of artificial intelligence to humans. And sentientism does two things. One is it says, okay, what about the risks of artificial intelligence to non-humans as well? What about the potential benefits? Right? So even if we're thinking about narrow or tool-based artificial intelligences or more powerful ones, we shouldn't just be worried about the impacts on humans. We should be worried about the impacts on non-human animals as well. But it also says that, well, if what we're worried about is sentience and species doesn't matter, then maybe substrate shouldn't matter either. And at least conceptually, we can imagine, and most people can imagine, that digital minds might exist, that maybe ChatGPT version 9 or 10 or at some point could conceivably actually be a sentient being in their own right. And that would mean they matter. So there is a serious concern amongst sentientist communities that are plugged into the artificial intelligence world that would say that could be a serious mistake. If we're creating artificial sentient beings that could suffer in various ways, or at least we just don't understand what their existences might be like, that would be a serious moral responsibility that there's a problem there. We should not charge into it. So there are people like Thomas Metzinger who've suggested a moratorium on creating digital minds. Others, of course, who think we should slow or pause or change the direction of artificial intelligence development. But it's a concern, right? And I think you can run that through all of the biological sentient beings as well. I think if sentientism leads very directly to veganism, and part of the implication there is that when we look at animal agriculture, yes, there's the horror of the slaughterhouses, and yes, there's the horror of their, the mutilations and the family separation and the exploitative practices and the constraints and all of the stuff that goes on. But the core of the problem is the breeding into existence of those beings so that they can be exploited in the future. So that concern about the responsibility of creating a sentient being is absolutely crystallized in our condemnation of animal agriculture, because you're explicitly creating a being for the purposes of harming, exploiting, and killing them for largely trivial ends. So that's not just a failure of responsibility. It's actually a betrayal of the beings we're creating, right? And you can, this is one of the ironies, in a sense, in a factory farming situation, those beings are treated so much like objects, like commodities, that there isn't really a relationship to betray. But in the much fated, supposedly humane, family farming, organic animal agriculture systems that you'll see on the marketing labels and that basically produce less than 5% of our products. In those situations, there actually is a relationship. The farmer creates the beings, often through force, and then has a relationship through the life of the being and then betrays them. There is a responsibility there and a direct, egregious betrayal. And that, I think, leads through into the way most sentientists would think about human procreation as well. I mean, again, it's sort of obvious for most people, but it is a very serious decision that you're taking. And it's not a serious decision just because of the impact on yourself and your life and the family around you. It's a serious decision because of the being you are going to be creating, and a serious responsibility is felt for their existence and how their lives might go for them, and whether they will have a good life that they're happy with, a life that they'll thank you for. So I think that's one theme that I think would be pretty consistent through all of those different domains from a sentientist perspective, is creating a new sentient being is a serious responsibility, and it's one we should not engage in lightly. But that still leaves quite a lot of space about whether that creation itself is intrinsically and always a moral wrong, or whether it can be done in a moral way.
Yeah, because just to flesh it out a bit more for people listening, if they maybe haven't understood maybe the relationship between sentientism and a question like this, in my understanding, because like you said before, you can start with a sentientist worldview, but then how you understand ethics and how we relate to each other and maybe the obligations we have can be radically different. So to give an example, pretty much everyone who will be watching this video will be familiar with utilitarianism to an extent. So you could have two utilitarians who are sentientists, and one of them could be a classical utilitarian, and so they can recognize that in some instances it's bad to bring a life into the world, but in some instances it may be good because you want to maximize overall utility, right? But then you could have another sentientist utilitarian who's a negative utilitarian who agrees that sentientism is correct and we should care about all sentient beings. But because they're a negative utilitarian, they don't necessarily see a reason to create someone for increasing utility. They're maybe, in simple terms, you could put them as maybe more risk averse, maybe. And that's, but between those two, I think you're right. In anchored in sentientism itself is this understanding that because sentience is the basis for moral consideration, if you're creating someone who's going to be morally relevant and require moral consideration, comes with that a responsibility. So I think that's quite that's very understandable. What you're saying is that at the baseline of adopting a sentientist worldview, you've got that recognition, but how your actual views cash out can be completely different within that sphere or that space. So the last sort of broad group of things I wanted to speak with you about were some of the more actual sort of practical project-based things going on in the sentientist world. So I know a lot of your work is obviously based around trying to popularize sentientism, getting it known, because it's a word that many people may not even know. So I know that there are sentientist communities. Can you just sort of paint a bit of a picture of what are sentientist communities, how do they function, and what sort of purpose do they serve?
Yeah, of course. So for a lot of people, their worldview is something that sits in the back of their mind. They don't think about it every day. It's just a way of thinking. So, and the same is true of sentientism. So for some people who come into the idea, they're just like, okay, I thought that way anyway. It's useful to have a word to describe it. I'm just going to carry on with my life as I was before. Other people, it does actually tune and adjust their way of thinking and might, change the types of things they do in their life. For other people, it is a more radical shift where it is oh shit, my eyes have been opened to a very different way of thinking. So it can be different. And for some people, it really just reinforces or motivates things they were doing anyway that were quite specific. So, if people are lucky enough to have time or resources to do sort of activism work or try and make the world a better place, their sentientism worldview might just motivate them to carry on doing those things. But there are people who are quite interested in the idea of popularizing and normalizing worldviews themselves, because they think, well, on the one hand, it's a bit disconnected from practical stuff, right? Saving lives or transitioning to end animal agriculture or reducing global poverty or solving disease or, facing off some existential risk, right? Those are quite specific things where you can see the impacts in the real world. Worldviews seem a bit more in the background, but at the same time, because worldviews underpin every decision that humans take, it's quite a foundational, quite a robust thing to work on, because if you can imagine really shifting someone's worldview, every decision they take for the rest of their lives is going to be influenced, hopefully in a more positive direction by doing that. So there are people who are interested in actually working on sentientism and normalizing it as a worldview, just as there are people who will, work on popularizing or, sharing religious worldviews or sharing humanism and getting more people to understand it and maybe accord with it. So the communities are interesting because they're not for sentientists, right? They are for anyone who's interested in these sorts of ideas. So they're completely open to anyone who's interested in a good faith, productive conversation about these topics, epistemology, the foundations of ethics, the philosophy and science of mind, what sentience actually is, those types of topics, but also the practical implications. So the communities are completely open. It's partly just the value of community, of being in a place where your friends and family around you might not be into these sorts of conversations. So it's nice to find an online home where you can have those sorts of conversations. Although increasingly we're starting to do some in-person stuff now too. So we had our first in-person meetup in London recently, and we're hoping to do more and more of those. We have some local groups in some cities around the world. But one of the other things we're doing links to what we were talking about earlier on, which is people are thinking about what might a sentientist world look like. So people are actually running thought experiments in our sort of Facebook Messenger groups or developing the website on what would a sentientist politics look like, or democracy or law or justice or language. So those are sort of projects for people who are interested in specific implications of sentientism, but also just the big problem of change. How do we drive change? If we think about politics and sociology and philosophy and psychology, right? How do we try and shift human worldviews, and how do we go about that difficult challenge too? So the communities are, they're there for community, they're there for interesting thinking and bouncing ideas around, but there are also some quite practical projects about, what would this world actually look like, and how can we bring it into action through campaigns as well. And they're pretty much everywhere. So, whichever platform people prefer, we're on them all. So we're on Discord and Telegram and Signal, and the biggest is on Facebook. There's people from over 100 countries in the Facebook group so far. As much as I find Facebook irritating, the group's fine.
Nice.
Just don't look at your feed.
Yeah. So, talking of putting things into action, I know you've done some, and you mentioned it earlier, some work in schools, and I know you've also been trying to get, unless I'm completely misrepresenting reality here, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's been efforts to try and get sentientism as a teaching point in the national curricula in the UK. Can you share a bit about what you're doing there?
Yeah, of course. So the main work I've been doing so far in the UK in education has been through religious education. And that might strike you as an odd place to start, given sentientism is a non-religious worldview generally. But religious education in the UK is quite an interesting topic, because it's pretty much the only space in the curriculum there is for talking about philosophy, ethics, epistemology, ontology, these really deep questions about how do we understand the world and what are good and bad and right and wrong even mean. There's pretty much nowhere else in the curriculum where you can do that. And religious education itself has gone through quite an evolution in the UK. It's very fragmented. So at the moment, there is no national curriculum for religious education at all. There's some basic standards and guidelines, but each local area has a committee that sets their own curriculum. So on the one hand, it's enormously fragmented and a bit of a mess, and there's loads of duplication, but it also does mean they can experiment. And while there's still a lot of quite conservative thinking in religious education, there are some teachers there who I'm sure would just love to do the old-fashioned thing from the 1950s of instructing kids on how to be a good Christian, right? It's moved quite a lot from those days, because over the decades and the years, they're grudgingly acknowledging that, okay, other religions exist and we should probably teach our kids about those. And then over time, okay, nearly half of people in the UK aren't religious, so maybe we should probably acknowledge that. And the Humanists UK organisation has done a great job of coming into classrooms and talking about humanism as a non-religious worldview. And in that context, there are a lot of really progressive religious education teachers who genuinely want their kids to come out of their classroom with critical thinking skills, with an appreciation of lots of different worldviews so we can live happily together in a multicultural environment. And so that those kids will also have the confidence to examine and challenge and maybe even change their own worldviews, right? And I'm like, yes, that's exactly what religious education should be. And in some places, it's even getting a name change. So it might be religion and values, or it might be religion and worldviews, to, again, make it much more open. It's just about different worldviews and ways of thinking about the world, whether they're religious or not. So obviously there's a selection bias, because the people who are more on that progressive, where are we going in the future mindset are much more likely to engage me talking about sentientism. But in a way, I'm just layering sentientism into those classes, so that there are now some kids around the country who are learning about, okay, here's Christianity, here's Buddhism, here's Hinduism, here's humanism, and here's sentientism as a different worldview. So one way that the teaching works is, that sort of pattern, right? Here's another worldview, here's another worldview, here's another worldview. And that can be done in quite a shallow way, right? Here's the priests, here's the temples, here's the religious book, here's the rituals, here's the festivals, right? Now we go on to the next one, and next one, and next one. And the progressive parts of religious education are shifting away from that approach as well. They're recognizing it's a bit shallow. It doesn't really engage with the depth, the philosophical depth of those different worldviews. So quite often they are switching to taking a more thematic approach, where they're asking deep questions. So they're asking questions like, well, how do Christians think about the nature of reality? How do Muslims think about the nature of reality? How do these religious worldviews intersect with a scientific understanding of the world, right? And then they're bringing in lots of different worldviews to think about how do we understand the world. And then the ethical questions, they're doing the same sorts of things, right? What do right and wrong and good and bad mean in a Christian lens, or in a Jain lens, or in a sentientist lens, or for a humanist? Why do they think things are good or bad? So there's that thematic approach, which really gets to these deep philosophical questions that sentientism is trying to answer. So it's been great fun, partly because I've been teaching RE teachers. I've been going to their conferences and going to their network meetings and teaching them about sentientism as a worldview. I'm soon going to be going to some of the teacher training for new RE teachers at UCL in a couple of weeks to take part in that sort of training.
Oh, nice.
But the most fun thing I do is doing it directly in schools myself. So, and that's just an enormous buzz. So whether the kids are 5 years old or 18 years old, I'll go in and run worldviews workshops and talk about these ideas with them. And it restores your hope for humanity when you do that, because little kids are the best philosophers, way better than the average adult on Twitter.
Yeah. So I this is like a big gripe I have with the UK education system as well, because I can remember when I went through it, I can't really remember any lesson. I remember having RE, we called it RE. I know in a lot of other parts of the country it's called RS, but religious education. And it was essentially what you were saying. You'd be this is the religion for this week or this month, and you'd get that more sort of surface level breakdown of what the religion is and the festivals and stuff like that. And there was no,
and then you have to memorize it all.
Yeah, exactly, for an exam. Yeah. And there was no meaningful engagement with deep questions of whether there is a God or not, or discussions on ethics, and people, going around the room and people sharing, or, well, I mean, kids are people, but when I say people, it sounds like I'm referring to adults, but, go around the room and each of us would sort of share, maybe what you think about a basic question of, should we care about animals, as an example. There was no sort of engagement like that. And I think that should be absolutely mandatory in schools. I think ethics as a standalone class or subject should be mandatory, because if you think about one thing all of us do all of the time, it's interact with other people or other individuals, non-human animals as well. And that is where ethics comes alive. It's in our interactions with others. I know obviously there's also the question of how we interact with ourselves and how we behave and towards ourselves. But yeah, this is something that is relevant for all of our lives every day. And yeah, I mean, I think it should have its own standalone lesson, not even just be part of a sort of wider, religion and worldviews class. I mean, that's a really good start, but it just pains me to no end that this is not like a massive thing that everyone has to engage with. Yeah. So my final thing I was going to, sorry, go on.
And I'd add to that, right? So there's the question of ethics, right? How to lead a good life and how to treat each other, right? I mean, this is absolutely foundational stuff. How can we not teach it well? But also on the epistemology, I think the same stands, right? So adults are tearing their hair out about kids being drawn into, TikTok conspiracy theories and fake news and, how do we tell what's true and what isn't? But kids are never taught about critical thinking or epistemology at all. I mean, it basically isn't. Even in the science lessons, it's just sort of assumed. It's like, we'll do an experiment and here are the results. But they don't really talk about, what is evidence? How do we judge evidence? What are the thinking fallacies? What are the cognitive biases? How do we make mistakes even when we think we're thinking carefully? How do we avoid dogma? And to these deeply important questions, I think the most important questions, which is why I ask every single guest about them, what's real and who matters, right? Just are almost not present in our education system at all. It's bizarre. The most important question, almost unaddressed, unless you're very lucky and you find a particularly talented, inspiring teacher who really wants to go deep. But it's difficult because this stuff isn't in the exams either.
The final thing I wanted to ask you about was I saw recently that you are working on a book. Now, I know you're still working on the book. It's not something that's published yet. So I know it's an ongoing, thing. But is there anything you can share with us about what do you explore in this book? And do you have a rough idea of when it might be out?
Well, it's a terrifying prospect because I find on podcasts and the YouTube, talking is fun. It's easy. It doesn't feel like work, but writing is hard work. So it's just a terrifying prospect of trying to crystallize all sorts of thoughts and write them down, particularly because I'm dealing with such, deep philosophical questions and spanning so many different domains as well. So I'm sort of terrified by even making the attempt. But the overall flow of the book, it does talk about the Sentientism worldview and explains very frankly why I think it's a good way of answering these questions. But more broadly, it's an invitation to recover that sort of childlike sense of curiosity, open-mindedness, and philosophical intellectual bravery that many people felt when we were 9 or 10 years old, and to sort of recapture that as an adult and to re-examine these deep questions of what's real and why do I believe these things and what matters and who matters. So we go through different ways of answering those questions. And then I do bring, our answers together and explain what the Sentientism worldview is, talk about how it contrasts and overlaps with other worldviews, because quite often there's some productive common ground we can work on helpfully. Then it goes into the question you asked earlier on, a sentientist life, what would that mean? And then a sentientist world that goes through all of these different domains and paints a picture of, maybe a better role humanity could play. So that's the idea for the book. I've drafted, I think, 6 of the 16 chapters so far, and I've written chapter summaries for the whole thing. So I've got a sense of the arc, but yeah, I'm terrified by the amount of work still required to turn it into something. So I'm not entirely sure when it will be done. I would love it to be, middle of next year, but we'll see how things go.
Well, whenever it is, I'm looking forward to reading it. So that was everything I wanted to go through. I will obviously include links to everything in the description that we've spoken about, including your podcast, which I think is maybe the main sort of landing place for people to go to if they want to hear you having more conversations with people. Is there anywhere else you'd like to specifically direct people towards, or anything else that you wanted to mention that I haven't captured in any of my questions?
So sentientism.info is the main website. So that has links to everything, our local groups, our global groups, the podcast and the YouTube. So that's another good starting point, as well as the podcast. On the YouTube, most of the content is me interviewing other people about these deep questions. But if you want a sort of summary of the Sentientism worldview in a presentation, there's also a couple of presentations there, including some I've been giving to the RE teacher. So if you want a sort of half an hour or even 15 minutes on double speed overview of Sentientism as a worldview and some of its implications, you'll find that there too. And the other thing would be just the communities. If you're even vaguely interested in these sorts of questions, go to your favorite social media platform, search for Sentientism and come and join our communities. There's no obligation. There's no gatekeeping. Anyone interested is welcome to come and join the conversations. But yeah, if you search for the word Sentientism, you'll pretty much find our stuff.
Nice. Okay. Well, I will include all the links in the description below. And yeah, that leaves me just saying thank you for joining me today. It's been really interesting. And yeah, it's nice to actually have a conversation with you, because I've been listening to you having conversations with other people for a few years now.
Yeah, it's brilliant to get the chance to talk to you. Thank you so much for your important work. And hopefully we'll see you at the next in-person meetup too.